Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Travel Podcast. My name is Hayley Sparkes, and it is so lovely, as always, to have your company. I am personally very excited for today's episode. I hope you will be excited to discover that we are talking about something that is very much a travel bucket list for so many people. We are diving into the world of safari, an absolute dream come true for so many of us, myself included. And we are very lucky because we are being joined today by a true expert on all things safari. So we're going to find out everything that we need to know. Dickie Ashcroft, welcome to the Travel Podcast.
Hi, Hayley. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm very honoured and always delighted to talk safari. So thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you. So you are joining us as an expert from Audley Travel. Tell me a little bit about your role and your specialist area.
I'd be delighted, and I appreciate flattery, so thank you very much. But I'm one of those lucky people who absolutely loves their job and skip to work on a Monday morning because I get to talk about safaris all the time. So I cover all of East Africa and Botswana. And I've been doing this. I've been working at Audley Travel now for actually, find out it's 8 years this month. um, and what we do at Audley and is that we create tailor-made travel experiences around the globe. I might add, we're very strong in lots of other areas, but we are particularly good, I feel, when it comes to Africa as well, and safari in particular. Um, in terms of kind of how I ended up at Audley, prior to beginning at Audley, I was a safari guide myself. I did my first qualification in Namibia, in northern Namibia. I then got a job as an apprentice guide, where basically you had to kind of wash lots of things, clean things, don't say a lot, and just learn the ropes. And then I eventually moved up the ladder, started doing mobile safaris in Namibia, did more exams, then moved to Tanzania. And in Tanzania, I was living actually in a national park as opposed to being a mobile guide. And I lived in a national park called Katavi, which is a very wonderful place. It's somewhere that was really special to me as well because it is very remote. It's one of Tanzania's remotest national parks, and I was there for 2 years. Um, and there are basically only a few thousand people might visit a year, and it was only accessed by light aircraft twice a week on a Monday and Thursday. So consequently, if there were periods where there were no guests, I had this national park almost to myself. There was two other permanent camps, and so that was a very special experience. But I ultimately spent a long time in the bush. I think the longest I spent in the bush without leaving was 6 months and 11 days, which was quite a stretch, but very cherished memories. And then after kind of taking lots of people on safari, this is why I now work at Audley and I organise safaris for lots of people. So one of the other terrific things about Audley as well, I might add, is that um, we're kind of one of our USPs is that everybody who works here has either lived or worked in their area of expertise. And so, also, when you do call to discuss a trip, whether it's to Botswana or Madagascar or the US and so on, you're speaking to someone who really does know that area intimately because obviously they've either worked or lived there. So that's how I ended up at Audley.
No wonder you love your job so much. What a fascinating career history that you've had. And it's wonderful for our consultants at Not Just Travel work so closely with you and the team and do get to tap into this expertise for their customers, which is brilliant. For anyone who has never been on a safari trip, can we just strip it back to begin with the basics? What does a sort of typical day look like on safari?
That's a really good question, and actually, it's one of those questions that when people like myself, who when you've been around safari for so long, you just presume people might know. But it's a great question because it is quite baffling. What is a day safari? So a day safari is well, typically when it comes to seeing wildlife. Wildlife is generally most active during the mornings and the afternoons when the temperature is cooler. Of course, you've got your nocturnal mammals and so on. But typically, during your day of safari, the best time to be out looking for wildlife is when it's cool. Early mornings through to mid-morning, and then early afternoons through down to sunset. So, with that in mind, a typical day on safari tends to begin with a very early wake up call just before dawn. And then it slightly differs, of course, subject to which national park you're in, and perhaps if you're doing a mobile safari where you're moving from A to B. But generally speaking, that it's much the same in the sense that you'll wake up at dawn, subject to the type of camp you're in. Most camps actually will bring you your coffee or tea in your room, which I have to say is something you get used to very quickly. Returning home to England and not having your coffee brought to you in bed is a bit of a rude awakening. But typically, you'll have start with an early morning. You then go out on an early morning game drive. So most places will use 4x4 open vehicles. So whether that be a Land Rover or a Land Cruiser, and typically there might be 4 to 6 people on that vehicle. But you'll go out as the sun is rising, and the sounds at that time in the morning are just magical. The bird dawn chorus, is really quite spectacular. And then you'll typically then be driving around with your guide for several hours. S- You may then have breakfast in the bush and continue, but ultimately your guides then searching for wildlife and bird life, and when they find something, obviously they'll explain and answer questions. Another important thing to also make guests aware is that when you are on a game drive, it's really important that you ask questions as well. Sometimes guests kind of might be a little bit shy about asking questions, but actually, the more questions people ask, from a guide's point of view, it's terrific because then the more that guide can elaborate. And then normally you'll come back to the lodge kind of like 11:30, 12 o'clock, something like that, by which time, bearing in mind you've been out since dawn, you then typically have brunch or lunch, and then go for a siesta or relax. For that middle part of the day, it's warm, the wildlife's inactive. Lions, elephants, buffalo, everything typically goes for shade in that middle part of the day. So actually being out in that middle part of the day, even if you wanted to, there are many lodges that would allow you to, but actually you don't necessarily need to, because also feel it's better for you as a guest to kind of reserve your energy. And so for that middle part of the day, you go for a siesta, a snooze, and then typically you'd have afternoon tea at around 3:30, 4 o'clock, and then you'd go out on another game drive in the afternoon, and that's my favorite time because the light. I mean, don't get me wrong. Of course, the light in the mornings is fantastic, but the light in that early afternoon to sunset period is just magical. Particularly also because you'll have had, if it's peak dry season, you've got a lot of dust that's being kicked up by the many ungulates that are living in that area. So often you're getting the most incredible sunsets, and for photography, that's a wonderful time. So that's typically your day on safari. Then normally you'd be back to the lodge just after dawn. I'm sorry, just after sunset. A lot of lodges as well will a lot of camps will you'd have what are you called your sundowner drinks. So typically, your guide will find a lovely spot as the sun's going down, and you stop the vehicle, get out and have a gin and tonic or a beer or something like that, and then back to the lodge for your evening meal and bed, and do it again the next day. So that's typically what a day might look like.
And of course, I can imagine the duration of the safari trips really do vary. But just out of interest, what would you say would be the sort of minimum number of days that people would need to really sort of immerse themselves in a safari experience?
Again, another really good question as well. Often, I find that sometimes people who haven't been on safari before think that they need to go for a really long time to ensure they see everything, perhaps a week or so on. But actually, in contrast, subject to time of year and where you're going, you know, you don't necessarily need to do a week. A common amount of time is actually 4 nights on safari, which does work really quite well. I have done some trips that have been even shorter, but typically, 4 nights safari is actually a really common amount of time. That said, of course, I think once you've done a safari once and you know what it entails, a lot of guests then might on their next safari might realize, what, we've got the safari bug. We love being in the bush. And actually, on the next trip, they might do 6 days or 8. And if you were doing a slightly longer trip, then a 3 and a 3, so 3 nights in one location, 3 nights in another works really well, or a 4 and a 4. But just for first time safari goers, 4 night safari in one national park works really well because you can relax, you can unpack, you get to know your guide over those 4 nights, and in the right time of year and in a good national park, you'll be staggered, or particularly if you're first time, you'll be blown away by what you see just on the first day. So certainly don't feel like you need to do a week on that first safari. Of course you can do, but just by 3 to 4 days, you'll still see a huge amount.
Brilliant. And let's talk a little bit about the accommodation side of things. You've mentioned about lodges in camps. I'm sure it varies vastly, but can we talk around the different kind of accommodation settings and what that might look like for customers?
So yeah, typically you can for the safari accommodation split things into either camps or lodges. There are now slightly more hybrids coming along, I would say. But traditionally a safari lodge would be a permanent structure that may have concrete footings, stone walls, thatched roof, and essentially almost a bit like a hotel in some respects in the bush. And then you've got your camps whereby these may be semi-permanent. So, some of which would have, wooden floorboards and that kind of thing, but actually the walls and the roof would be of canvas. And actually that part of it is ultimately a tent as well. But what you're finding as well more and more now as well is that this kind of hybrid whereby you've got, permanent lodges that are also kind of the tented. So ultimately the room inside is still, a lovely room with an ensuite bathroom, plumbed in, shower and lavatory and that kind of thing. But ultimately, the walls are canvas. Um, but in terms of kind of, what I feel really passionate about as well is that certainly for a lot of people when it's their first fire, they might kind of be a little bit perturbed by staying in a tent or a traditional tented camp because they're worried about the wildlife and perhaps might be worried about creepy crawlers, that kind of thing, and so might kind of lean more towards staying in a lodge, that, as I say, might have thick walls. And sometimes lodges can be bigger. Sometimes lodges might have generators going in the background. There's more sounds and smells and so on that kind of prevents wildlife from getting closer. So actually, what I often try and encourage a lot of my guests to do, whether it's their first time or their fifth time on safari, is to at least for a few of the nights that you're on safari, is to stay in a true tented camp, one that has the kind of a low impact on the habitat around it. And the reason being is that that's all part and parcel of the safari experience, and but also for me personally as well, what I often say to guests is that of course, when you're on safari, seeing the wildlife is a huge part to play. I'd say 75% of the overall experience, but 25% of your experience is actually are those moments when you're in your tented camp, you're in bed asleep, or you're getting ready for your evening meal, and you hear something outside. And because you're in a small tented camp, as I say, wildlife often can come closer, and can come through camp. And so you might be in your room, and a herd of elephants comes through, or you've got giraffe, browsing outside. And it's those moments that often guests remember the most. And again, of course, you can get those from lodges, but similarly also by staying in that tented camp, not only is the experience I feel enriched because of the tradition of being in a tented camp, but also it's kind of those moments when you might have wildlife coming through camp, which you don't necessarily get if you're staying in a big lodge.
Yes, that makes sense. And it all sounds so magical. But for anybody listening who hasn't had the safari experience, I'm sure everyone's an animal and nature lover. But I can understand that there may be reservations if you've not experienced it, thinking, oh, what about the safety element for argument's sake, being in a tent environment with elephants or large mammals around, how do people feel reassured that safety is obviously a huge priority?
Yeah, another good question. Again, I often like to when I'm asked that question, which is quite often, is the first thing to say is that you're not on the menu, essentially. Nothing really wants to eat you, which is always reassuring to know. But just from a, from a safety point of view, you're looked after so well. Just the safari industry in many of the countries, or in all of the countries you might wish to visit a safari. The safari industries have been going for so long. The people who are looking after you, from the lodge managers, the guides, the waiting staff, and so on, they spend months in the bush. They're very familiar with it. The level of service is fantastic, and guests really do feel that. But in terms of safety, the other thing to bear in mind is that during the day, when you're out and about, obviously your guide's looking after you. But certainly in the afternoons and the evenings, the early mornings, when you're going to and from your rooms, it's mandatory in a lot of lodges that aren't fenced, that a member of staff will always escort you to and from your room. So whether you're going for breakfast or you're finishing dinner and going back to your room, you will always be escorted by someone. And typically, in a lot of these places, the person escorting you, certainly if it's in East Africa, it's often Maasai, and they're very familiar. I mean, they're born and raised in the bush. They're very familiar with wildlife behavior, and so they will escort you to and from your room. And then similarly, also once you're in your room, nothing big or small is going to get into your room. So even if you're in those tented camps, the ones I mentioned with the canvas walls, that canvas wall is secured underneath the floorboards, so to speak. Equally, if you're in a lodge, you've got stone walls as well. And so as long as you keep your front doors shut, your zip, the door, the zip of the tent closed, when you're not there, nothing big or small will get in. And so, guests are very safe. So as long as you listen to your guide and wait for your askari to come and escort you to and from your room, you needn't have any worries. You'll be very well looked after.
Sounds very reassuring. Now, Africa being so vast, can we just touch on some of the different destinations for safari, and how do we kind of break that down and maybe decide where we'd like to go?
Yeah, so exactly that. It is vast, and there are so many different places to go, and they all offer so much, and the diversity is huge. And so this is also why so often guests will get the safari bug. And some people might think you haven't been on safari. You think, well, actually, well, if I go to this one place, then I've been and done it, and that'll you know tick all the boxes for safari. But far from it. Often, what will happen is someone will go to one place, love it, realize another country offers something slightly different, and then you want to go there. But in answer to your question, what helps make the decision? I suppose it's largely, I find personally, actually, I mean, there's so much to do. I think an important thing to bear in mind to begin with is not to try and bite off too much, and obviously kind of really kind of make sure that you're, you know, conscious of the key priorities of things perhaps you want to see or experiences you want to have, and so on. But for me personally, I think, whenever I get someone who hasn't been on safari before and they're just completely unsure of where they want to go, I often feel that a good way of making that decision is that, let's say you want to be away for 10 days or 2 weeks. As I mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily need to have 10 days of safari or 2 weeks of safari. So then it comes down to actually what else you want to do after the safari side of things. So for a lot of people, that might be going to a beach, which is amazing. So if it's then going to a beach, then of course, there are some stunning beaches on the East African coastline. So that would obviously then push you to more towards East Africa, for example. Equally, if you've always wondered that you want to see Victoria Falls, which again, you're not necessarily beachy people, you want good safari, but you want something else to finish with, then Botswana or Zambia, for example, fantastic areas to go and finish with Vic Falls, to see the falls and do the many kind of activities you can do in that area. But then equally as well, why South Africa is so special, because, again, if you're not necessarily beachy people, perhaps you go to beach holidays elsewhere in the world, but you want something else. And, the winelands, the history of South Africa, time in Cape Town, so, when one common denominator is each of these places does offer phenomenal wildlife viewing, in a variety of different national parks. So for me, it kind of comes down to actually what else it is you want to do after the safari bit, or in addition to the safari bit, as well.
I think that's a really helpful way to help narrow down where you want to go, especially for first timers. And the travel consultant that sent you this podcast, that again is that's what they're there for. They're working very closely with Dickie and the team at Audley Travel to help tailor a bespoke trip that is just right for you. And really fascinating, Dickie, that you said picked up that you said often people often think it's I said at the start, bucket list destination, a dream thing for people want to do in their lifetime. I made that wrong assumption that it's kind of a box ticked. Interesting to hear that people become safari addicts, and of course that makes sense. There's so much to see and do, and diversity depending on where you go.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And actually, kind of anecdotally, we Audley Travel, we're very lucky. We've got a lot of repeat clients. But our Africa department has some of the highest numbers of repeat clients because people get that Africa bug and safari bug. And so the other thing as well is that, of course, yes, you might see elephants and lions in one country and you can see them in another, but it's also about the habitats and the geology and the different scenery you'll get in the different countries. So, typically people might have their first safari in, South Africa, for example, or Kenya's Masai Mara, and then they realize, actually, do you know what? I'd love to see the Okavango Delta, one of the world's largest inland deltas. Or they might say, I've heard of this Ngorongoro crater place, which again, one of the world's largest intact dormant calderas. To go to Kilimanjaro. So yes, I'm still seeing wildlife in these places, but it's the habitat, the topography that's so different to each other. Equally as well, you've got Namibia and the desert there as well, which is just so stunning. Some of the tallest sand dunes in the world. And then not to mention, typically what I also find as well is that people will then progress. They might go to one place first, then they might have always want to have seen the migration, but then equally they might then want to, what, I've heard that the gorillas is just the most breathtaking wildlife experience. I've seen elephants and lions. So then you go up to, into the mountains of Uganda or Rwanda to see the gorillas, not to mention the chimpanzees as well. So that's why, often people will get the bug. And as I say, yes, although perhaps you are seeing some of the same mammals in certain areas, it's about the different scenery and the different habitat, and also the people as well. You forgive me for not mentioning that as well. Like a lot of so many guests, when they haven't been on safari before, will come back and, prior to going, the focus had been on the wildlife and so on. But actually, one of the first things so many people say when they come back was actually the people they met, would just took their breath away. And actually, many guests will come back with, often slightly different views on things, and feel also hugely enriched by the experience of meeting people who live in some very remote, very deprived areas, and can really leave a mark on people who haven't been to Africa before.
A wonderful experience. As you said, I think enriching is a key word there. And again, I'm sure it varies on the location that you decide upon, but in terms of time of year, is there any advice on when might be a good time from the UK to sort of travel on a safari trip?
So the lucky thing for guests and for the safari community is that you can pretty much go at any time of year, and in different countries, it's still a terrific time to go. That's the first thing to mention, whether it's East Africa or Southern Africa, for example. They all have their, peak points and lower seasons, but ultimately, pretty much any time of year is good to go certain areas. I suppose the what I would say is that, it slightly depends what type of safari you're looking for and the reasons for going. Naturally, of course, if you're tied to school holidays, East Africa is fantastic during that summer school holiday period. It also coincides with the migration. But if you're retired and you don't need to go in school holidays and you've got a broader, time of year from which to choose from, then there are merits to perhaps avoiding, school holidays because we all know, flights and accommodation can be more expensive. It equally slightly depends as well what kind of wildlife you're looking to see and that kind of thing, and to avoid rain seasons. But certainly from from a UK point of view, another kind of time of year that we find guests appreciate being away for is that January, February, March kind of time of year when the weather in the UK is kind of kind of can
Depressing.
get a bit oppressive. Yeah, exactly that. So, certainly places like East Africa is phenomenal for that kind of time of year as well because you've got beaches and sunshine. But again, you've got, later on in the year in winter, in the UK winter, South Africa's amazing and that kind of thing. And so in answer to your question, I know it didn't really answer your question. Ultimately, almost any time of year is good to go. It just depends what you're looking for. Equally as well, often we'll have a conversation with guests that actually, there are certain times of year when safari is quite a lot more expensive than it is in the shoulder season or off season. And for a lot of the destinations now, these kind of shoulder season periods or off season periods, they're also becoming growing in popularity because actually, your money can go that much further, but you're still getting a phenomenal experience as well. So I know that didn't perhaps answer your question as well as you'd have liked, but kind of, it slightly depends on what you're hoping to experience and also what if there's a certain time of year you just want to be away, we would always find a location that works for you.
It's really helpful, and it leads me on to my next question, which, again, I know it's impossible to answer, but just to give us a bit of a steer when it comes to a budget for somebody that says this is a bucket list destination, maybe something that they are going to save for. Is there a kind of starting budget that we'd be looking at? And I'm sure the choice is endless than how much you want to spend thereafter. But have you got any advice on what you'd be looking to save up?
So, yeah, this is quite a tricky one to answer just because the spectrum can be so large. The other thing as well is it slightly depends on the type of trip you're looking for and what you do and don't want to experience. So, what I would say, one of the things with audit is everything we do is tailor made around the individual, whether that's a couple or a family and so on. Now, when you come to kind of the more tailor-made trips, they tend to be a bit more expensive because ultimately, you are picking when you want to go, what you want to do, and where you want, what you want to see. In contrast, for example, if you were looking to do a group trip, then the price can, really come down quite a lot because ultimately you're joining a group and it will be a preordained itinerary and so on. But if you're looking for kind of a more of a tailor-made trip, the other thing I often kind of have to explain to clients who perhaps haven't been before is that safari is actually, um, for a lot of people who haven't been before, they're surprised at how expensive it is, and a little bit, and one of the reasons for this is that one important thing to bear in mind with a safari camp, as opposed to a beach property, for example, is that that safari camp is often in the middle of nowhere. So the operating costs are much higher for that safari camp to get all the food and alcohol there and so on. The staff there, it costs a lot for the lodge. You're also, your national park fees are included whilst you're there, and your safari activities, your guiding, whether that's walking safaris or boating, for example. So as a result, time on safari costs quite a lot more than time on the beach might cost. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And so when it, but in answer to your question, I would say, if you are looking to go out of peak season and to do kind of like a classic 4 night safari, 5 nights beach, something like that, which is an awesome trip, subject to what you get the flights for, you could be looking at, something in the region of £5,000 per person, plus minus. But then again, it can go up to quite a lot more, subject to how much longer you're looking to have on safari, and the level of lodge that you're looking to experience as well. I mean, the unfortunate thing is though that much like many things in the world, though, we've certainly seen that flight prices have been rising and so on, and so that's something that's to be considered. But back to our the earlier thing we were talking about you don't feel that you need to do a week on safari. 3 nights, 4 nights, in a good location with you'll still have a phenomenal experience. So I don't want anyone to be put off from their bucket list trip. Of course, it is a more expensive thing, but actually, just that first taster, I'm sure will give people the desire to do it again in the future.
And that's why working with the experts is so important, because if budget is of a consideration, which it won't be for everybody, but of course it will be for some. It's the expertise of knowing where you can direct clients at certain times of year, different accommodation, different length of time to help them make those holiday dreams a reality. And that's brilliant. Are there any mistakes, Dickie, that common mistakes that people make when it comes to sort of planning or booking a safari? Perhaps if they're doing it on their own and haven't had the experience of an
Yeah, there
expert.
there are. So I suppose one of the first things I often say to people is actually when planning a safari, it's also important to consider what you don't want to see or experience. So what a lot of people when they're planning or starting to explore safari options, naturally there are lots of websites that are all trying to sell you something and say their area is better than another's. But what for a lot of guests as well, when planning a safari, they kind of rightly presume that where they're going is going to be a vast wilderness, and they might be some of the few people who are exploring that area on any particular day. Far from it. There are many places that one can go on safari that in this modern day are very busy with lots of other people. And so, you know, if let's say you do or your guide finds a pride of lions who are all relaxing in the shade, there are certain national parks at certain times of year that you could be looking at those lions in from your vehicle with your guide, and there could be 10 or 15 or 20 other vehicles crowded around them. So that's where it's really important to kind of to consider actually that is something I don't want to experience. I do want to go somewhere where I get the sense that I'm in a remote location and I'm off the beaten track. So the first thing is, as I say, is to kind of consider what it is you don't want to see. I'd also as well kind of again, when you speak to experts, if there are lots of places that also might be fenced or might kind of appear as though they're wild on the website, but actually when you come to a specialist who's been to that area, knows that, the location, we might be able to elaborate and actually, what, that place isn't as remote as you think and is not as wild and so on. So that's another thing, because certainly there's some guests who of course, they want to see lots of wildlife, but they also want to have this sense of wilderness and just kind of this awareness that these places are still pristine and untouched. So that's something else. In addition, as well, I would say it's also important to kind of not want to try and do too much, and also appreciate that the distances involved often from getting from A to B to C are significant as well. And so sometimes I find if guests have kind of trying to plan their own itinerary, their own trip, or equally if they're using an agent who perhaps doesn't know these regions as well, often I'll see an itinerary that someone else has put together, and unbeknown to that client, in what the itinerary might say, on day two you're driving from A to B, you know, the client isn't aware that actually that journey could take 7 hours on a very bumpy road. And the entire day is lost. And that's a very precious day of your holiday. So again, when you come to experts or people who really know these regions, we ensure that, the trip runs smoothly, but also that there are no hidden unpleasant surprises. Because ultimately the only thing that matters to us is that your experience is fantastic. And so those are other, essentially not trying to bite off too much and but also using people who know these areas because we can tell you that actually I've done that journey and I know you don't want to do it yourself. It's much better if you actually go this way around or that way around. So I suppose those are a couple of kind of things that are important to consider.
Dickie, all of your advice and tips are so helpful, so useful. And I would just ask before we finish, is there anything else, any other piece of advice you would say to any of our listeners who might be dreaming of safari? What would you say to them?
I would say do it because it is something that's so unique, and I know I'm biased, and you'd expect me to say this because I sell safaris, but there's no other destination like it. Now, whether that's you're on safari in Southern Africa or East Africa, but being in a vast area that's wild, unfenced, and you still have herds of elephants roaming, the largest land mammal there is, a big bull elephant, 6 tons. And when you're close to a big bull elephant, the smell, it's like it's just, it's like I often say to some haven't been before, it's like almost being in Jurassic Park. You
Oh,
can't believe
no.
these creatures still exist and are roaming
Mhm.
freely. In addition, when you see your first pride of lions, or when you hear a lion roaring in the morning, it's these are sounds and sights that will never leave you. Um, so it is something that I think is so crucial to experience, and particularly also these ecosystems are so fragile and they need our protection. And by you visiting, you are helping to protect these areas as well. So it's what I would say is that it is something that I think is I would love everybody to experience, but also to experience it in the right way. In areas that are well managed and well maintained and so on. But yeah, you've just got to go and do it. And also the people as well. It's of course there are lots of wonderful places to visit in the world, but there's nothing quite like being on safari, meeting indigenous people, and seeing this wildlife in its natural habitat is very special.
Truly magical, once in a lifetime, or more than once for people that
Hope, yeah,
become
more than once.
addicts.
Yeah,
But it really is an enriching, incredible experience. And Dickie, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share with our listeners your history, your vast experience, your knowledge, your tips, what to look for, what not to look for. We really, really appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners are sat there thinking, right, okay, let's do this, let's make this happen.
yeah. I hope so. Make that dream come reality for sure.
Thank you so much, Dickie. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Remember that the travel consultant that sent you this podcast works very closely with Dickie, the team at Audley Travel, to help bring these safari dreams to life. So if you've got any further questions, you want help with an itinerary, do go back to your travel consultant and we can work to create that dream safari experience. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week.